Many thanks, and it's good to be able to at least have a fleeting appearance in this wonderful conference. The fault of my not being sort of more active in this is entirely mine. There was some confusion about email addresses and stuff, so by the time I got to know this was happening, yesterday I was completely spoken for, and I am from lunchtime today as well. So, but anyway, it's great to be here. And sort of from the time I sort of first interacted with the Juxtapose team, sort of it struck me that Juxtapose is in fact a very interesting single word descriptor of this whole process, this whole intellectual enterprise, because obviously the verb to juxtapose is to place objects close together, but it's not just to place certain objects, entities close together, but to place them close together for contrasting effect. I mean, the whole point about bringing these objects in proximity is to draw out the contrast, and that's exactly what to juxtapose means. And in a way, I've been sort of pondering about what it would mean in the China-India context to actually sort of what are, as it were, the ways in which we could juxtapose, but also what are some of the outcomes of such a juxtapositioning. Now I'm an international politics person, so obviously everything I say will invariably sort of betray my own disciplinary bias. But it seems to me, and I have about 10 minutes, so I'm not going to spend more than about 3 minutes, and I'll be really making three points. It seems to me that there are really three different sort of intellectual enterprises that emerge from any process of juxtapositioning. The first of them is obviously comparative, where you sort of putting these objects side by side, and then explicitly trying to sort of in some ways compare them. Now, China is quite obviously one of the very few countries in the world with which India can be sensibly compared. All sorts of comparisons are rife in the human and social sciences, of course, but sort of India-China comparison sort of even intuitively makes sense. So there are multiple disciplinary perspectives. There are multiple issue areas. There are indeed even a variety of different historical periods on which sort of so there are different you can always select a suitable matrix upon which to sort of then mount your comparative exercise. But it's always seemed to me that when Indian analysts attempt this comparison, it is usually in a unidirectional yardstick sense. In a way, it's sort of looking at China as a way to then sort of reflect on India. It's obviously something that makes sense. And I've also sort of always felt that the more, within quotes, policy relevant the study is, the greater this tendency. So the more sort of far removed you are from sort of a policy purpose or a policy ambition, the more you're likely to view China qua China, and not view China as an exemplar, an allegory, or a metaphor. All of which you see a great deal of. So the comparative enterprise, I think, is one that sort of is going to invariably continue. And I've always felt that the Indian analysts who get closest to sort of viewing China qua China are actually those who are really engaged in the literary and the cultural study of China. They are the ones who sort of in a way are most able to look at China as China, without sort of then immediately going off in all sorts of directions, explicit and implicit, with regards to what that could possibly imply for India. So that, it seems to me, is one sort of intellectual enterprise that emerges from a juxtapositioning. The second is what I would call relational, and this is when you put two objects together, you also ask, you not only ask the question, in what ways are they similar and different, but you also sort of invariably end up asking the question, in what ways do they relate to each other? And in fact, in some ways, the more stark the contrast, the more sort of in a way that relational issue does sort of seem to sort of emerge. And a lot of international relations work, which sort of looks at the dyad of China and India, is actually explicitly relational. So we could ask the question: why do states come together? Why compare states? Why look at states and societies together? And what is it that impels states to sort of, as it were, come together? And there are actually, in international relations, in theoretical terms, some radically different answers to this question. So for instance, a realist would typically argue that states make alliances to aggregate power. So power aggregation is the reason why states come together. Liberal theorists would tend to sort of argue that states cooperate in order to solve problems and thereby enhance their opportunities. So states realize that, doing things by themselves would lead to suboptimal outcomes, and they therefore believe working together, cooperating on a common problem actually gives you, outputs that you would not be able to individually attain, and therefore it's sort of rational to sort of, as it were, come together. So, so you got power aggregation and the kind of the realist way of looking at the world, and then you have sort of problem solving as a second kind of reason why states get together. And there's a third reason, which sort of comes from that branch of international relations that sort of tends to view international relations from perspectives of culture and identity. And the third answer really is that states come together to build community. So it seems to me in some ways, it's useful when you think about countries and dyads of countries and try to think about them in relational terms, that we don't get too beguiled by the way in which we actually do things, which is build historical narratives, which are about very often high-level visits, the kind of diplomatic history kind of side of things, or an economic history perspective, which is about trade and investment relationships, or the lack thereof. All of that is there, but I think somewhere out there we need to address those core questions about why, what impelled any two states really to come together. Now, China and India, if you were to look at it this way, are actually fascinating because I believe that sort of China-India relations have actually spanned the security spectrum. And what is the security spectrum? Very simply, it's war is one end of the spectrum and alliance is the other end of the spectrum. War is when you're actually sort of in conflict with each other. Alliance is when you're actually working together in a conflictive situation. So, and China-India relations actually in the 20th century pretty much span the security spectrum, which is something which we very often sort of, either forget or do not sort of sufficiently emphasize. So, 1962 is there as this kind of, this climactic moment, and that's true. War is a part of sort of, China-India relations, there's no question about that. But so is alliance. And one of the reasons we forget that, of course, is that the two countries were allies before Indian independence and before the Chinese Revolution. So, we are both going back to, as it were, the proto-history of the states that have emerged in these two large continental territories. So, and there is always an uneasiness of that sort of that inheritance, of that heritage. So in the case of India, sort of, the heritage really of the British Raj in India. And in the case of China, obviously, the entire period of civil war, the Japanese occupation and the anti-Japanese sort of struggle. So in relational terms, I think, there is some very interesting stuff that can be done on India-China, but it's really going to require, I believe, viewing things rather more systematically than we have tended to. The third sort of point, and I will end on this note, and I hope I'm not going beyond my allotted time, is sort of, juxtapositioning in order to sort of arrive at certain conceptual insights. So, the purpose is not so much then comparative or relational, it's really conceptual. And for me, at least, in terms of sort of the work I do and I'm, currently sort of doing, that seems to me sort of one of the most interesting aspects of juxtapositioning, China and India. And I'll just give you one example of where sort of, there are really some conceptual insights that do emerge. For instance, I, in my writings, sort of assert that, while China is rising, India is emerging. And I believe that it's not just a semantic difference. I don't believe it's just a play on words. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to go along with anybody who argues that China is an emerging economy. Okay. But China is a rising power, even though it's, I'll go along with it, with the understanding that it's an emerging economy, but it's a rising power. And the distinction, I believe, is in fact a very important one, because unlike emerging powers, which could have a systemic impact in the future, a rising power already has a systemic impact today. So it's very easy for us to sort of, in a very superficial way to sort of say that, well, China, India, yeah, but it's actually not so. In purely conceptual terms, in terms of their impact upon the international system, in terms of their impact on global governance, in terms of their impact on a whole raft of other issue areas that I could, if I had more time, get into in greater detail. There is a difference, I would argue, not just of degree but of kind between China and India. And one final point, and this is sort of interesting, is that in a way I also believe that sort of, in a way, China's rise is masking India's emergence. So the fact that India has got that decade and a half lag over China, in a way is proving to be, I would argue, in fact, incredibly advantageous to India. Because the established powers are so focused on China and its rise, that in effect, India and its emergence is really not emerging on the radar scope. So India is not emerging on the radar scopes of the established powers, in an identification friend and foe as a foe. So India's there. China is the sort of like, it's the first wave, as it were. And it's not just India, just another country to sort of throw into the mix, Brazil. Brazil's emergence in some ways, I think, is very similar. Is that these countries sort of are also sort of growing, their capabilities are enhancing in both absolute and relative terms. But the fact that China has taken the lead really has worked very advantageously to countries such as India and Brazil. Because all the focus of the established powers is really on China. I think I've gone beyond my 10 minutes, so let me stop here.
Okay, thank you very much.